By 1711, Great Britain faced a systemic bottleneck, an unserviceable national debt of £9 million, a legacy of the War of the Spanish Succession. The traditional tax and pay model had hit its ceiling. Robert Holley, the Lord Treasurer, and his associate John Blunt needed a financial hack. They founded the South Sea Company, not primarily to trade, but to act as a debt management vehicle. The problem was the debt. The solution was to allow government creditors to swap their stagnant bonds for shares in a new, exciting venture. This was the birth of the debt-to-equity swap. It moved the burden of the state from the taxpayer to the investor, turning a national liability into a liquid, private asset. The hardware of the state was being refinanced by the software of the market, setting the stage for a world where government debt became a tradable commodity. The engine behind this scheme wasn't the Bank of England, but a private competitor, the Sword Blade Bank, run by Elias Turner and Jacob Sawbridge. This institution acted as the shadow banker for the South Sea Company. They weren't interested in traditional lending, they were interested in market liquidity. By providing the credit necessary for investors to buy shares, they created a self-reinforcing pump. John Blunt, a former scrivener, was the operational lead. He understood that the perceived value of the stock was more important than the actual profit of the company. He began a massive marketing campaign, promising the public that the South Sea Company would soon control the legendary gold mines of South America. It was a venture capital moonshot where the product was a dream, and the collateral was the British government itself, creating a feedback loop of credit that the world had never seen before. The company's asset was the Jacinto, the exclusive right to supply the Spanish colonies with goods and labor. On paper, it was a monopoly. In reality, it was a logistical nightmare. Spain only allowed the company to send one ship per year, the Royal Prince, to trade in the New World. For a company valued in the millions, the actual output was negligible, but the directors, including Sir John Fellows and Charles Joy, were masters of narrative management. They focused the public's attention on the potential of the monopoly rather than the reality of the balance sheet. They were selling future dividends that they knew the Royal Prince could never deliver. This was the transition from a commodity-based economy to a speculative-based economy, where the story of the trade was more profitable than the trade itself, allowing the company to trade on expectations rather than results. Did you know that in the 18th century, Britain tried to pay off its national debt with a single company? It sounds crazy. Let me tell you about the South Sea Company. After years of expensive wars, Britain was drowning in debt. So, in 1711, a bold plan was hatched. The government basically handed over its debt to a new trading company, the South Sea Company, in exchange for shares. The idea was that profits from trade with Spanish America would make everyone rich and wipe out the national debt. Speculation went wild. People from all walks of life, from servants to lords, poured their life savings into South Sea stock. The share price skyrocketed, creating a massive bubble. But here's the twist: the promised trade barely happened. When reality hit, the bubble burst spectacularly, bankrupting thousands and shaking the entire British economy. It was one of history's first and biggest financial crashes. By June 1720, the South Sea stock had skyrocketed from £128 to over £1,000. This was the first global mania. Everyone from Isaac Newton to common labourers was participating in the systemic upgrade. But there was a problem: competition for capital. Hundreds of smaller bubble companies were forming, ventures to extract sunlight from cucumbers or make square cannonballs. To protect their monopoly on the crowd's money, the South Sea directors pushed through the Bubble Act of 1720. This law made it illegal to form a joint stock company without a royal charter. It was the first instance of regulatory moating. The South Sea Company used the power of the law to crush its competition, ensuring that every available pound in London had nowhere to go but into their own ledger. They had successfully weaponized the law to eliminate market alternatives. The liquidity crisis hit in August 1720. The price had reached such an height that the insiders, including John Blunt himself, began quietly selling their shares to lock in profits. As the sell-off began, the Sword Blade Bank could no longer provide the credit to prop up the price. The golden loop turned into a death spiral. Trust, the invisible glue of the system, evaporated in a matter of days. The stock crashed back down to £150, wiping out the life savings of thousands. This was the first systemic market failure. The audit revealed corruption in the highest levels of the British government. John Aislabie was sent to the Tower of London, and the Sword Blade Bank collapsed. The dream of infinite liquidity had ended in a forensic nightmare of empty pockets and worthless paper, forcing a massive re-evaluation of how public credit should be managed. The clean-up fell to Sir Robert Walpole, who became the de facto first Prime Minister. This was a systemic bailout. It proved that once the state's debt is tied to the market, the state cannot let the market fail. This established a too-big-to-fail doctrine that underpins modern finance. The South Sea Company itself survived as a hollowed-out debt-servicing machine for another century. The audit of 1720 taught the British that while bubbles are dangerous, the financial infrastructure they leave behind is permanent. They had successfully converted a disorganized debt into a professionalized national credit system that would fund the next century of global expansion. As London recovered, the focus shifted from the imaginary trade of the South Seas to the physical trade of the East Indies. The British East India Company, led by men like Josiah Child, began to apply the lessons of the VOC and the South Sea Company. They realized that to control the trade, they needed to control the land. They began moving from being merchants to being sovereigns. The systemic upgrade was now moving into its territorial phase. The debt from the South Sea bubble was now the foundation of the British Consolidated Fund. This was public debt at its most efficient. It allowed Britain to borrow money at 3% to build a navy that could conquer markets that yielded 20%. The arithmetic of power was now in Britain's favour, and the money trail was heading toward the Indian subcontinent. Josiah Child, a former South Sea investor, became the visionary of the EIC. He argued that the company should be a nation in India. He pushed for the building of forts and the recruitment of a private army. This was the corporate state at its peak. The EIC wasn't just trading spices, it was managing territory. By 1750, the company had more soldiers than the British Crown. This was private sector sovereignty funded by the public debt of the London markets. The systemic upgrade had reached its final form, a corporation that could tax a foreign population to pay dividends to its London shareholders. The golden loop was now a global network of extraction, and the receipts were being written in the blood and ink of Bengal. The Bank of England, led by governors like Sir Gilbert Heathcote, became the heart of this system. They provided the standardized currency and the stable credit that the Spanish had lacked. Every colonial war and every corporate expansion was funded by the bank's ability to issue debt. This was monetary sovereignty. By centralizing the national credit, the bank ensured that the British state never faced a liquidity crisis like the Habsburgs. The hidden history of the 18th century is the story of how the Bank of England outfinanced the world. They had turned war into a capital investment and peace into a debt collection period. The world was now accounted for in the books of Leadenhall Street and Threadneedle Street. Tea became the new alum. By 1760, the EIC had achieved a global monopoly on the tea trade from China and India. This wasn't just a drink, it was a taxable commodity. The British government relied on tea duties for 10% of its total revenue. This was commodity-based taxation. The EIC provided the goods, the public provided the consumption, and the state provided the military protection. It was a tripartite agreement that funded the expansion of the British Empire. But as the volume of tea grew, so did the debt required to protect the roots. The 7 Years' War was about to test the limits of this tea and debt system, forcing a new systemic squeeze on a tiny group of colonies across the Atlantic. The 7 Years' War, from 1756 to the year 1763, was the first truly global war. It was fought in Europe, India, and North America. Britain won, but the victory came with a systemic bill that was staggering: £133 million. This was the largest debt in human history at the time. William Pitt the Elder had successfully borrowed the victory, but the Bank of England now needed to find the cash flow to service the interest. The hidden history of the American Revolution starts here. In the 1763 audit, Britain had more territory than it could afford to manage. They needed a new revenue stream. They turned their eyes toward the American colonies, looking for a way to make the subsidiaries pay for the parent company's military overhead. The Stamp Act and the Tea Act weren't just taxes. They were service fees for the British Empire's protection. From London's perspective, the American colonies were a low-yield asset that needed to be optimized. But the colonists, led by merchants like John Hancock and George Washington, saw it as extractive overreach. They were already running their own internal economies and didn't want to be leveraged to pay for London's global wars. This was a shareholder revolt within the empire. The Americans wanted to decouple from the British financial system. They realized that as long as they were part of the imperial ledger, they would be the ones paying for the iron bankers' dividends in London. The hidden asset in the American Revolution was land. George Washington was one of the largest land speculators in Virginia. He and his peers had invested heavily in the Ohio Valley. But the British Proclamation of 1763 froze these assets, forbidding settlement west of the Appalachians to avoid expensive wars with native tribes. This was asset freezing to the American elite. The British Empire was now a bad manager that was preventing them from realizing the value of their investments. The revolution wasn't just about liberty. It was about asset liquidation. To unlock the wealth of the continent, the Americans had to default on their British political obligations and create their own sovereign ledger. The Boston Tea Party was a direct attack on the East India Company's monopoly. By destroying the tea, the colonists were destroying the EIC's revenue stream. This was direct action against a corporate entity. The British responded with the Coercive Acts, which was effectively corporate martial law. They closed the port of Boston, freezing the economy of an entire city. This was the moment of systemic break. The Americans realized that their economic agency was incompatible with imperial sovereignty. They needed to find a new creditor to fund their revolt. They looked to the old rivals of the British, the French and the Dutch. To fund the war, the Continental Congress did something desperate. They printed the Continental Dollar. This was fiat currency, money backed by nothing but the promise of future victory. It was a hyperinflationary experiment. By 1779, the currency was virtually worthless and not worth a continental. This was the price of revolution. The American people were paying for their freedom through the hidden tax of inflation. But while the paper money failed, the physical assets, the land and the labor remained. The Americans were looking for a systemic bridge to get them through the war. They found it in the form of French credit and Dutch loans, turning a local rebellion into a global financial war against the British Bank. The hidden hero of the American Revolution was the Dutch banker Nicholas van Staphorst. He led the syndicate that provided the first sovereign loans to the new United States. This was venture diplomacy. The Dutch were shorting the British Empire by longing the American Republic. These loans allowed the Americans to buy French gunpowder and pay their troops. It was the first international recognition of the US as a creditworthy entity. The Americans had successfully refinanced their revolution, moving from the imperial debt of London to the commercial credit of Amsterdam. The Golden Loop would return to the Netherlands to fund the birth of a new kind of state. Yorktown, in 1781, was a military bankruptcy for Britain. The cost of continuing the war was now higher than the value of the assets, the colonies, the British Parliament, led by the Country Party. The taxpayers forced the king to cut his losses. This was disinvestment. Britain conceded the American territory to focus on the much more profitable assets in India. They realized that formal empire in America was a bad business model. The Treaty of Paris, 1783, was the final audit of the First British Empire. The Americans had won their sovereign ledger, but they were now left with a massive post-war debt and a collection of 13 uncoordinated subsidiaries that needed a new central management system. The legacy of the 18th century heists and wars is the modern financial state. Alexander Hamilton, the first US Treasury Secretary, used the British hack to save America. He assumed the state debts and created a national bank. He realized that a national debt, if managed professionally, is the glue of a nation. It creates a class of creditors who have a vested interest in the government's survival. The hidden history of the US Constitution is the story of creating a stable operating system for capital. We moved from the bubbles of London to the bonds of New York. The systemic upgrade was now complete, a sovereign republic run by a professional financial architecture. The world was now accounted for in a way that allowed for the first industrial takeoff. As season 1 of the Golden Loop closes, the money trail has crossed the Atlantic and returned to the north. We have seen the birth of the bank, the corporation, and the sovereign bond. We have seen how the hidden hand of finance built the cathedrals, the empires, and the revolutions. But a new energy source is about to hit the ledger. The steam engine is about to turn capital into coal and labor into factories. The Industrial Revolution is here, and with it, a systemic upgrade that will change the very nature of human work. Follow the money from the coffee houses of London to the factories of Manchester. The audit of the machine is beginning, but before we delve into the receipts of the machine, let us first pivot and look at Persia's Golden Ledger, the hidden history of Iran. I'm Edward Turfall, and this is The Hidden History. Subscribe for Season 2, Iran, the Golden Ledger.